Welcome! Today we're diving right into one of history's most chilling, completely unsolved tragedies. It all kicks off in the absolutely brutal winter of 1859. Way out in the freezing, snow-capped peaks of the Russian Ural Mountains. So, a group of 9 friends headed out on what seemed like a totally normal expedition. Now, these guys weren't rookies. They were super experienced hikers and really seasoned mountaineers. But out there, something literally unimaginable happened, leading to their terrifying and violent deaths. You've probably heard of it. The whole nightmare became known globally as the infamous Dyatlov Pass Incident.
Let's get right into it. So here's the massive question we're trying to answer today. How on earth did 9 incredibly capable, seasoned mountaineers simply vanish into the freezing Siberian night? Listen, we aren't talking about a group of weekend hikers who just took a wrong turn and got a little lost. These were physically fit, highly experienced individuals. Yet something happened up on that mountain. Something so intense that it caused them to flee their only source of shelter right into a pitch-black, -40°C blizzard. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the real core of our mystery, which is the massive gap between their high level of expertise and their seemingly irrational, fatal end.
To understand just how baffling this was right from the start, we have to hear this actual quote from the original 1959 search party records. Investigator Maslenikov radioed back to headquarters with this: "Thus far, we have been unable to ascertain why had all of them fled the tent while semi-clad. This is incomprehensible." I mean, put yourself in the shoes of those investigators for a second. You hike up this freezing, desolate mountain, totally expecting to find a group of missing hikers, and instead, you walk into a scene that completely defies all logic.
Geographically speaking, we're way out in the remote, totally unforgiving northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. Specifically, the group was setting up camp on the eastern slopes of a mountain called Kholatsiakho. And in the indigenous Mansi language, that translates, quite ominously, I might add, to Dead Mountain. This is an area of extreme, intense isolation. If you run into trouble out there, there's no quick rescue coming for you. You are entirely on your own, fighting against the elements.
Section 1. The Dyatlov 9.
We really need to understand who these people were to truly grasp why their actions that night were so wildly out of character. So, there were 9 hikers in total, ranging in age from 20 to 38, and they were led by a 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov. Most of them were either students or alumni of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. But here is the absolutely crucial point: their certification level. They all already held Grade 2 hiking certifications, and this specific trip was designed to earn them their Grade 3. At the time, that was the absolute highest certification available in the entire Soviet Union. Earning it meant traversing 300 kilometers in brutal winter conditions. They knew the snow, they knew the bitter cold, and they definitely knew how to survive. These just weren't the kind of people to make amateur mistakes.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. The expedition officially kicked off on January 23, 1959. By January 28th, one member, Yuri Yudin, actually had to turn back because of severe joint pain, which, incredibly, ended up being a stroke of luck that saved his life. On January 31st, the remaining 9 members cached their extra gear down in a wooded valley. And then, on February 1st, instead of dropping down into the relative safety of the tree line to set up camp, they made the fateful decision to pitch their tent right there on the exposed slope of the mountain.
The surviving photographs recovered from the cameras found inside their frozen tent really paint a picture here. They show the group setting up camp and trekking through a completely blinding snowstorm. You can literally see the weather rapidly deteriorating around them. A severe cold front was moving in, which was dropping the temperatures dramatically and whipping up winds to around 30 meters per second. These final images show us the faces of the group, completely unaware that a massive disaster was just hours away.
Section 2. The bizarre discovery. So, weeks went by with absolutely no word from the group. When the 1959 search party finally managed to excavate the partially snowed-in tent, what they found basically birthed a modern legend. Here is the detail that absolutely shocked everyone. The tent wasn't ripped open by the howling wind. It was slashed open from the inside. Think about that for a second. The group used knives to desperately cut their way out of their own shelter. Whatever happened inside that tent was so immediately terrifying that they couldn't even use the front entrance. They just cut straight through the heavy fabric and ran. But the mystery only deepens when we start looking at their footprints in the snow.
Those prints revealed a truly chilling sequence of events. First, obviously, there's the panic of slashing the tent. Second, despite fleeing for their lives and leaving behind their thick coats and heavy boots, the tracks in the snow showed they actually walked calmly down the slope. Let that sink in. They weren't running in a scattered, chaotic panic. The footprints were organized. And third, they traversed a full 1.5 kilometers down the mountain to a large cedar tree near the forest edge, where they somehow managed to build a fire.
Section 3. The forensic evidence. Okay, let's dive into this.
To really separate the wild internet myths from reality, we have to look directly at the actual autopsy findings. The victims ended up falling into two very distinct groups. First, you have the hypothermia victims. These were the first 5 bodies found near that cedar tree and scattered on the slope, seemingly trying to crawl their way back up to the tent. They all died of exposure to the cold. But then, 2 months later, the spring thaw revealed the remaining 4 bodies in a ravine further into the woods, and these trauma victims completely upended the entire investigation, because they did not just freeze to death.
The autopsy reports for those 4 individuals found in the ravine detailed some truly inexplicable injuries. We're talking about massive symmetrical rib fractures and severe, deeply depressed skull fractures. In fact, the medical examiner at the time noted that the sheer force required to cause these specific injuries was equivalent to a high-speed car crash. But here is the most baffling part of the whole thing. There was almost zero external skin damage. No scrapes, no bruising. It was as if they were crushed by this immense, highly localized pressure. Furthermore, several of the bodies were missing soft tissue. Specifically, eyes and tongues were gone.
So, we are brought right back to this haunting central question. What could possibly compel 9 highly trained, expert survivalists to cut their way out of a tent while calmly in their socks into a deadly blizzard and somehow end up with internal injuries mimicking a catastrophic car crash? This complete void of logic is exactly what birthed decades of wild speculation.
Section 4. Decades of theories.
You know, when facts just don't seem to add up, human imagination rushes right in to fill those gaps. Just consider the bizarre anomalies that really fueled the conspiracy fires here. You had bodies found in basically only their underwear, which led to theories of paradoxical undressing. That's a strange phenomenon where freezing people suddenly feel burning hot. You had the disturbing missing eyes and tongue. You even had completely separate hiking groups out in the region, reporting glowing orange spheres in the sky that very same night. This incredible cocktail of weirdness led to theories ranging from secret Soviet weapons testing and KGB cleanup squads to infrasound-induced panic and, yes, even attacks by a Russian Yeti. We're exploring these objectively, not to endorse them, but because they show just how incredibly desperate people were for an answer. And honestly, the speculation really took off because of exactly how the 1959 investigation ended. Soviet investigator Lev Ivanev abruptly closed the entire case with this incredibly vague, almost poetic conclusion. He stated that the hikers died due to an overwhelming force or compelling natural force. That was it. The area was shut down and closed off for 3 years. The case files were quietly tucked away, and the grieving families were left with absolutely zero closure. That phrase, overwhelming force, essentially became a blank canvas for every conspiracy theorist on Earth.
Section 5. The Slab Avalanche Hypothesis.
But science, as we know, doesn't like a vacuum. Let's fast forward to a major scientific study published in 2021. For years and years, a standard avalanche was completely ruled out. Why? Because the terrain was just too flat, only about a 30-degree incline, and there was no massive debris field covering the campsite. But modern snow mechanics actually points us to something else, a slab avalanche. Now, this isn't your movie-style massive roaring wall of white snow. It's a highly localized, incredibly dense block of packed snow that fractures and slides almost like a solid sheet of concrete. And the theory is that it was triggered precisely because the hikers dug into the slope to pitch their tent, fundamentally weakening the snow base right above them.
You might be wondering, if they weakened the slope, why did it wait hours to actually fall? Well, that brings us to a crucial weather phenomenon known as the katabatic wind. This is a violent, downward blast of heavy, high-pressure cold air. Throughout that terrifying night, these fierce katabatic winds were invisibly blowing tons and tons of new, heavy snow onto the slope directly above the tent. It was continuously loading more and more weight onto that weakened ledge the hikers had dug out.
Now, what's really interesting about this modern model from scientists at the Swiss University EPFL is how perfectly it explains the seemingly unexplainable. It maps out exactly like this. The hikers cut into the slope to make camp. Then, the katabatic winds load heavy snow onto that spot over several hours. Finally, the heavy slab snaps, releases, and crashes down onto the tent.
This relatively small but incredibly dense block of snow slamming into the sleeping hikers perfectly accounts for those high-velocity, car crash-like chest and skull fractures. And because it's a blunt impact through the heavy canvas of the tent, it happens without leaving external scrapes or cuts on the skin. And honestly, this leads us to what is easily the most heartbreaking realization of the entire story: the sheer tragedy of their expertise. Think about it. If they were just amateurs, they might have panicked, stayed near the crushed tent, and tried to dig it out. But they were experts. They knew the absolute worst place to be during any avalanche is right in the impact zone, in case a secondary slide comes. Fleeing immediately to the tree line is a textbook, perfectly executed survival move. They correctly assessed the immediate danger, calmly evacuated their severely injured friends, and headed straight for the trees. But the extreme -40-degree cold was an enemy they simply couldn't outlast without their proper gear.
Okay, but what about all those bizarre anomalies we talked about earlier? Well, when we actually apply logic and forensic science, they begin to unravel. The missing eyes and tongues? We have to remember those specific bodies were found months later, face down in a running stream beneath the snow. It's simply the tragic result of natural decomposition and aquatic scavengers. The mysterious undressing. It wasn't some paradoxical madness. The surviving hikers desperately cut the clothes off your already frozen friends to wear themselves, in a futile, last-ditch attempt to stay alive. And those glowing spheres in the night sky? Declassified records now show the Soviets were testing R-7 intercontinental ballistic missiles hundreds of miles away, and the exhaust from those rockets glows brilliantly in the crisp winter sky.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that modern science and forensic meteorology have finally provided a highly logical, deeply tragic answer to what happened that terrible night. We now have a robust scientific model that completely explains the injuries, the timeline, and the seemingly bizarre behavior. But I want to leave you with this final thought. In a case so heavily shrouded in myth, heavily reliant on computer models, and utterly devoid of any living witnesses, will the ghosts of Kulatchak ever truly rest? Or will the sheer weight of the legend always cast a shadow over the scientific facts? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning everything, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.